This is Dr. Ben Weitz with the Rational Wellness Podcast, bringing you the cutting edge information on health and nutrition from the latest scientific research and by interviewing the top experts in the field. Please subscribe to the Rational Wellness Podcast on iTunes and YouTube, and sign up for my free ebook on my website by going to drweitz.com. Let's get started on your road to better health. Hey, Rational Wellness Podcasters. Thanks for joining me again today. And we've got a great guest today. We've got Dr. Tommy Wood, and we're going to talk about working with athletes with various dietary approaches, including athletes who want to use a ketogenic diet. Tommy Wood is a senior fellow in the pediatrics department at the University of Washington, and he's the chief scientific officer for Nourish, Balance, Thrive, which is an online-based company using advanced biochemical testing to engineer sustained health and optimal performance in athletes. He has an MD degree from Oxford and a PhD in physiology and neuroscience from the University of Oslo. Thanks for joining me here today, Tommy.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So I wanted to focus on how you work with athletes to help them improve their performance. So when you see a professional, say, cyclist or runner for the first time, what's the first thing you do and how do you approach it?
So I think we're at a point now where we know that there are so many things that are going to affect performance. And most athletes, professional athletes, it's the same with, most guys in the biohacking sphere, the type A executives, doctors, lawyers, all those kind of guys, they'll get hyper-focused on one thing. So it will be the diet or the supplements. Whereas I think what we really focus on is making sure we get a really good idea of the big picture. So often the first thing that people will do when they come to us is they take, we have a subjective lifestyle questionnaire, and it's, how do you sleep? How's your sex drive? How's your digestion? How often are you angry without other people knowing about it? How often, what's your mood like? And the interesting thing is that with all the data we have, we can actually use the answers to those questionnaires to predict what we're going to see on biochemistry. So if you fill in this questionnaire, Ben, and based on your results, I can tell you whether you have a gut dysbiosis, I can tell you whether you have problems with blood sugar dysregulation, just because how tightly subjective symptoms, like how you feel, correlates with the biochemistry. And Chris Kelly, who's the CEO of the company, he's a computer scientist, and he's used some machine learning algorithms to sort of predict some of that stuff. So that allows us to, A, get an idea of the whole person, but then also begin to drill down into what might be the particular issue in this athlete, basically straight off the bat. And then you'll sit down with myself or one of the other people in the company, one of the coaches, and we like to think that everybody can do everything. It's really important. And we also discuss things continuously. So we have a Slack channel, all the results come in, everybody's part of the company is discussing everything, sort of coming up with new ideas, things that maybe we can use, a new approach in somebody if that's going to be important. Then you'll do some testing. We do some blood testing, some urine testing, some stool testing, because a lot of the guys who come to us, they have digestive issues, and that's just the particular population that's kind of come under our radar, I guess, particularly because high intensity and endurance exercise can be really taxing on the gut. Or you've basically been overtraining, undersleeping, under-recovering, all that kind of stuff for so long, you've made yourself susceptible to whatever might then want to populate your gut or you might be exposed to. So we do all that testing, and then based on what we find, we'll intervene. There may be some supplements, there may be some protocols. Most of the stuff is lifestyle-based. And then we'll sort of go from there. We'll work in short sprints. Every couple of weeks, you'll meet with a coach, you'll come up with a plan, and we'll slowly build things up. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, and we'll just sort of slowly build that. So it's not a huge amount of information that you can't digest, and then everything becomes overwhelming. We'll just slowly build on that and eventually create somebody who's much more robust for the long term and can keep performing as long as they want to.
So do you typically see endurance athletes the most? Are those the type of athletes that you tend to see most often?
Yeah, that's definitely where the company started. So, like I mentioned, Chris Kelly, he actually founded the company alongside another doctor and his wife. And Chris and this other doctor, Jamie Kendall-Weed, they're both professional mountain bikers, or they were pro-level mountain bikers. They had their pro cards. And so that was kind of the endurance athlete who had those kinds of health issues, because that was something that Chris himself struggled with. Those were like the original kind of clients, triathletes, runners. But we've definitely expanded out from there. So we have some people who just, if your performance goal is being able to play with your kids until you're, however old, or you want to be able to play with your grandkids, or if you're, we now have people doing more high intensity sports. So we have everything from Olympic weightlifters to obstacle course racers, CrossFitters. So yeah, we started in endurance, but we've definitely branched out from there.
So if you have an athlete who comes in and he has gut issues, he's complaining of symptoms of gas or bloating or abdominal discomfort or diarrhea or constipation or things like that, what are some of the things that you're looking for, and then how do you approach it?
Yeah, so I think the testing is important. How do you know what's in there unless you look? We do a combination of urine testing, which can pick up particularly some fungal and clostridial metabolites. We do a combination of both culture and PCR-based stool testing. And I think we're at the point where no one test gives you the answer that you want.
Right.
So we definitely do a combination.
Which stool test are you using most often?
At the moment, we're using the doctor's data with parasitology ×3 and the GI map, the Diagnostic Solutions GI map.
So you do both of them, or
we do both, and we do the Great Plains organic acids test because it has some of the metabolites
right.
on it.
Okay.
And between those three, that usually gets us, most of the way. A lot of people will come to us with, previous breath tests or something like that. We don't often do them ourselves, but we often have results that we work with.
And what are some of the most common gut problems you see, and how do you approach those? And do you try to take care of those before you get into the athletic performance program, or is it incorporated into it?
So everything's kind of intimately connected, right? So first of all, if you want to try and treat what's going on in the gut, you need to make sure that the body itself is healthy so that you can then foster something better afterwards. So making sure, the first thing that we do is, we're addressing sleep, stress, diet, and diet quality are obviously super important. Other things that maybe people think less about, like your purpose in life, like what it is you're doing on this planet. Because if you don't have a purpose, like basically all the health problems just kind of disseminate out from there. So all of those things, speaking to people, motivational interviewing techniques, trying to get people to figure out what it is they're trying to achieve, what it is they want to do. And often, they come, and the performance is the hook, right? I want to qualify for the Boston Marathon, or, they're an Olympic athlete on their Olympic training cycle, and they want to, perform as well as they can at the next Olympics. And that's very important. But, it's kind of our job to sort of show them the big picture and find out where else there may be issues cropping up. So sometimes you just have to dive straight into the athletic performance, and I'm like, this is the thing. I have a short time period. I need to perform better at this race at this time. Then you need to do that. If you've got more time with somebody, which is obviously what we prefer, then you can sort of build out the whole thing. So try and create a robust body through all those, lifestyle and cognitive approaches. Then, common things are common. So we see a lot of H. pylori. We see a lot of yeast overgrowths. We see quite a few people with clostridial overgrowths, which obviously then causes some knockdown effects, can even affect some neurotransmitter function and things like that. So those are kind of the things that pop up, and we tend to use a lot of parasites. So entamoeba, we've seen some cyclospora recently, probably because it's on the GI map test, but it wasn't on any of the tests that we saw previously. And that's a known pathogen. You can look it up on the CDC. Like if you have it, you should try and get rid of it. And we will usually use a combination of herbal protocols. Although so I'm an MD, we have another MD on staff. We're not acting as people's primary care physician because we're working remotely. So we're not handing out prescriptions, but we can definitely help people go and get that from their doctor. If they just need H. pylori, some people just want to do H. pylori triple therapy and just get it done, that's fine. We'll have the test, help them go to their doctor, get the prescription. So that's never been an issue. Some people would prefer to try a herbal protocol. So just depending on what people prefer,
And so the H. pylori, you're picking up on the stool test. Do you ever do the serum or the breath testing for the H. pylori?
No, we don't. Just because of the way we work, we do everything remotely. We ship it to you. You do everything locally. You do your blood test locally. Right. You go to your Quest lab. It would be nice if we had access. So some people definitely have a relationship with a gastroenterologist already. They'll go in and get a formal test. Some people are getting endoscopies and they're getting biopsies and seeing H. pylori that way. So however, so we're not testing for it directly, but we'll definitely see results from lots of different places because these are people who've often had symptoms for a long period of time. So they'll have some test results already that we can work with.
And C. diff is often a very difficult condition to treat. How do you approach that?
Yeah, C. diff is really tricky, absolutely, and we're picking up. Sometimes seeing the toxin on the GI map. So the GI map measures both the DNA of C. diff and the toxin itself. There are sometimes you just need to go to antibiotics, and if you have C. diff is it can be really dangerous, toxic megacolon, all that kind of stuff. It's rare. I saw it when I was working in hospital. We definitely haven't seen it in the community, but it's a potential risk. So sometimes you just need to go straight for the antibiotics. Other things that seem to work fairly well for Clostridial infections in general. So a ketogenic diet, you mentioned that. That's one particular subset of patients who have some kind of Clostridial overgrowth seem to do really well on a ketogenic diet. It seems to keep their symptoms under control. There are a number of herbal approaches that you can take. So there's definitely some evidence for things like black cumin seed oil, lauricidin can work. There's basically a combination of things like that. There's one other thing that we tend to use that
Saccharomyces boulardii.
Yeah. So we used a lot of Saccharomyces boulardii. There was a period of time when it didn't seem to really be doing much. So that seems to come in waves. So sometimes it's really helpful and sometimes it's less helpful. So unfortunately, there's a bit of a trial and error process, particularly with something like C. diff. But so Saccharomyces boulardii has definitely been helpful in the past.
So let's talk about carbohydrates and athletes, and how do you approach carbohydrates, glycogen loading? Is this a big advantage for athletes? When do they need to get the right amount of carbohydrates? How important is that window after they've exercised to replenish? Some of those questions.
Yeah, there's loads of questions in there, and there's loads of ways we could go with that. So one of the most frequent things I end up saying to the people that we work with is they should eat more carbs, basically, because the people that we work with tend to come more from a low carb kind of sphere or a paleo sphere, and carbohydrates have basically become something that we're not supposed to eat anymore. And sometimes it's even still tied to that old fat phobia. In the 70s, 80s, 90s, we weren't supposed to eat fat either. And then even now we're told actually we shouldn't be eating protein either because that can activate mTOR and IGF-1 and that causes cancer. And then actually just they're not eating anything, right, or they're not eating enough. They're intermittent fasting, they're low carb, they don't want to eat enough fat. They're low protein. And they're trying to train for 20 hours a week. And
take out FODMAP foods and take out histamine foods and take out, and there's nothing left.
Low histamine, low FODMAP, keto, autoimmune paleo with intermittent fasting. And you can probably see, it just doesn't work, right? Especially if you're trying to, if you're trying to fuel for a good amount of training. People then have, the thyroid function goes through the floor and sex hormones stop being made and you don't sleep and you're anxious all the time. And so one of the things, getting people to eat more food, particularly in our clientele, is super important. Then when it comes to the carbohydrate piece, I don't think people should be eating the volume and types of carbohydrates that the traditional endurance or any kind of sports community is telling you. Powerade, it's something like 2 to 4 grams per pound of body weight of carbohydrate, if not more. You know, it's huge volumes of carbohydrate, and it's supposed to be, you know, highly refined flours and sugars. And a lot of people come to us and they've eaten that way, and then they've been training the way they were told to train, which is long periods around, you know, lactate threshold, you know, pushing the body really, really hard. And that combination just really tends to break a lot of people. So I don't think we should be eating like that, but targeted application of carbohydrate. So like I say, so after an intense training session, and you definitely cycle that around your training. So one thing that I like to use, and is kind of becoming more popular in the research as well, is basically day-to-day carbohydrate cycling, something called sleep low. So what you would do is you do a high intensity workout in the evening, then you have a low carb, you know, protein, fat dinner. The next morning, you maybe do a fasted workout. So then it's like so you did high intensity the night before, then you do like a long, slow aerobic. You know, we often promote like the MAF tone method. So it's 180 minus your age is your target heart rate. And maybe you go out for an hour or two like that. And then after that, you would eat some carbohydrates. So you've kind of depleted glycogen. You've had a period of time where glycogen is low, you do some aerobic exercise, you kind of activate all those pathways that you want in terms of AMPK, mitochondrial biogenesis, all that good stuff. And then you make sure you eat enough, including enough carbohydrate, and you sort of, you load back up, and then you get some of those more anabolic pathways and you replenish glycogen. And that way you can get benefits from all those different things, but you're not sort of, you're not continuously restricting yourself, but you're not continuously shoving carbohydrates in that can then cause issues. So stuff like that, I think, works really well.
So what are we talking about in terms of, for the average, say, 170, 80 pound athlete, how many grams of carbohydrates are you talking about, and what form do you like?
Yeah, so everybody wants a number, and I usually start with a gram per pound of body weight. I think that's a great starting point. And particularly, you know, we have guys training 1, 2, 3 hours a day. That can go up, you know, that's definitely not a maximum. That is, in my mind, that's a minimum. So it can go up 2, 3, 4 times from there. If you're doing very high intensity exercise, you know, some obstacle course races are now training, you know, 2 or 3 hour training sessions of circuit training, you know, high intensity, in and out, you know, loading, carrying, climbing. You know, I think you need quite a fair amount of carbohydrate to fuel that. So then we definitely focus on real foods. So you can be getting that from sweet potatoes, bananas. I'm okay, you know, I'm definitely okay with some rice, some other potatoes, depending on, you know, if you're sensitive to something, if you need to be low FODMAP, if you need to be autoimmune paleo, and we definitely do use those approaches, then you can tailor it that way. But in that kind of athlete, I'm not too worried about it.
What about like the glycemic load? Do you want a higher glycemic, lower glycemic, a mix?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it does. You're going to hear me say it depends a lot. I'm afraid that's just how it happens. So in some people, I might even say I want you to have a protein shake with some maltodextrin in it. You know, that's high glycemic. You know, it's going to get in there quickly. I don't use it very frequently, but in some people, if they're just not getting in those, you know, they're not getting in that carbohydrate, they're not recovering fast enough. Sometimes you just need to use that. If you can get it from sweet potatoes, rice, bananas, great. But you know, the 1% might need something slightly more processed, slightly more aggressive. And if you need to use that, then that's fine.
So what do you think about using a ketogenic diet, or what about athletes who are trying to run their system on fat? How well does that work? What are some of the advantages and drawbacks to trying to be a keto athlete?
Yeah, this is one of the most contentious discussions in sport currently. And you have guys like, people have heard of Steve Finney and Jeff Volek, and they've been working on this for decades now. You know, they are the guys who create, you know, the art and science of low carbohydrate for athletes, I think is the name of their original book. And you know, they've been studying this for a long period of time. The FASTER study was a study that they did, came out a couple of years ago. And there's follow-ups actually of that study coming out, in terms of, they did some muscle biopsies and things as well. But looking at how keto-adapted athletes use fuel compared to high-carb athletes. And where we're at this point is that we know fuel selection and how you're using carbohydrates and fats definitely changes on a ketogenic diet. we're not at a point where we can say that improves performance. And there's been very few studies that look at it for long enough to then show you see an increase in performance. So there are some people who are actively sort of muddying the waters. So there's a professor called Louise Burke in Australia who's running very short-term, poorly controlled studies of a ketogenic diet or exogenous ketones, and it doesn't work. It makes the athletes perform worse, or they have gut issues. And like I said, I don't think that really tells us anything, and it's just kind of it's just kind of muddying the waters, because you're not giving the athletes time to adapt to whatever it is you're trying to do, and then it just lets people argue even more. There's another, so probably the most recent study that's closest to the answer of this came out of New Zealand, and Karen Zinn was one of the people involved in it, and they it was just five high-level cyclists, and they put them on a ketogenic diet, self-selected, so they wanted to go on a ketogenic diet, and then they sort of supported them through it. And they had 10 weeks, so at least that's a reasonable amount of time to adapt. And then it was really variable how the people responded. So some people, their power output decreased, some people their power output increased. Most people didn't really see any benefit in VO2 max, but one person did see an increase in VO2 max. Overall, there wasn't a huge performance benefit. On average, there may have been a decrease in performance. But like I said, if you look at the results, it's super variable. So some people may end up doing better, but other people's don't, or other people won't. So it's kind of something you have to play with yourself. There are a number of things that are worth bearing in mind. So if you look at some of the really famous ketogenic athletes, the long distance runners, so guys like Zach Bitter, Sammy Inkinen, and maybe some of the best known ones, when they're doing high intensity exercise, or they're doing Sammy Inkinen published on his blog, and we've sent it to a few people, just to kind of illustrate this point. He was doing a stage race, a very tough mountain bike stage race over multiple days. And when he had a long, hard day on the bike, he ate some carbs afterwards, 200-400 grams of carbs, and he was still in ketosis the next morning. So if you're a hard-working athlete who's trying to stay, get periods of ketosis, eating carbohydrates doesn't necessarily go against that idea. So if you're working really hard, sometimes you just eat more carbohydrates, but that doesn't mean that it sort of decreases the benefits that you get from the diet, if that makes sense. When it comes to some other potential benefits, so we talked, there are some things that go on in the gut where the ketogenic diet seems to work really well. There are other things, if people have some proteobacteria produce a lot of endotoxins, then a ketogenic diet seems to work less well. The fat sort of increases endotoxin translocation across the gut wall. They seem to be especially if they have a bulletproof coffee or something, loads of liquid fat, they feel really foggy, and they don't feel good afterwards. So again, depends on what's going on inside. But there are some potential benefits in terms of how people fuel for their exercise. So when you exercise, you divert blood away from the gut, and the more intense the exercise, or the longer the exercise, the more that happens. So if you're doing very long training sessions or very long races, somebody who's fat adapted probably doesn't need to fuel as frequently. They are better able to access the energy they have in stored body fat, and then they don't need to be trying to get the gut to digest stuff or absorb stuff, which when you're exercising is actually really not what the gut wants to be doing. And then when you're doing very high intensity exercise, have you done some prolonged sprints, say to get to the finish line, the last 5-10 minutes of a race, something like that, that's when the blood really gets shunted away from the gut. And then afterwards, the blood sort of comes rushing back, and actually that's probably, again, not a very good time to start throwing food down the hatch. So the story that Chris likes to use is, he goes to cyclocross races. These guys are sort of punishing themselves really hard, especially the last 5-10 minutes. And the first thing they do is they grab a beer and a taco from the taco truck. And that's just the worst thing that you could be doing for your gut at that period of time, because it's just not geared up. It's not geared up to be digesting that stuff, even at the best of times. So in a low carb, or somebody who's spent some periods low carb adapting to that, maybe they don't need to eat immediately after the race, and then they can give their gut some time to sort of rest, get its blood supply back, and then get ready to sort of get some food in. And I think particularly because we see athletes with messed up guts, having that ability to not eat continuously either during the race or immediately after the race, I think that can really help them give the gut a break, which then sort of improves their health in the long term.
I talked to one nutritionist who said he likes to look at a lipid profile to sort of get a sense of how well his body can process different types of fats to see if this is something that's working for them.
Yeah. So that's a really interesting point. And, we do look at the lipid profile. The problem is that there's loads of, I guess it depends on what kind of lipid profile you're looking at. So if you're using like the True Health diagnostics, Thomas Day Springs, that's probably the most advanced lipid panel that you can look at. You're going to look at things like cholesterol absorption. You're going to look at so a lot of the lipid particles, and that's going to tell you about some of the way that you process certain fats. So maybe the saturated fats are maybe not for you because you've got an increase in LDL particle, or increase in LDL, big increase when you went on a ketogenic diet, so you eat more saturated fat. But equally, there are some other guys that are basically seeing that in the hyper responders, so people whose LDL goes up when they go on a ketogenic diet or eat a lot of saturated fat, it seems to be like a shift in terms of energy distribution. And then actually so if you ended up eating even more fat, actually your LDL would come down because you're transporting fat in kilomicrons rather than an LDL. So it's a really complicated picture. We see other stuff. So if we're looking just at a basic lipid panel, which is where we tend to start, LDL can go up because you have a chronic infection. It can go up because you're hypothyroid, or you have poor thyroid signaling, because that's really important for the LDL receptor. So yes, at its most basic level, if somebody goes low carb or eats a lot more saturated fat and their LDL goes up, there are a lot of people who are then switching them to more monounsaturated fats, some polyunsaturated fats from like fish and, the omega-3s, and more sort of like avocados and, maybe some nuts, and olive oil. And that seems to work really well as well. The problem is, particularly in the athlete with multiple things going on, there's so many confounders that you really have to sort of figure out what's going on in each individual person, and just the lipid panel on its own might not be able to figure that out for you.
Right. Good points. What do you think about mitochondria? We know the mitochondria are the energy powerhouses of the cells, and obviously energy is really important for athletes. I heard a whole discussion about this. Apparently last year or the year before, LeBron James was following this very low carb diet for a while, training very hard in the off season. He got really lean. And so the discussion I heard, and I couldn't really find a good research on this, was that if you train hard on a low carb diet, you develop higher levels of mitochondrial density because the body, is struggling to produce enough energy. So it produces more mitochondria. And then and apparently this is something that LeBron did, that then you kick in a higher carbohydrate approach, a more traditional sort of carbohydrate approach. Now you've got more mitochondria density, and now fueling with carbohydrates as well. So you may get a beneficial effect from utilizing that. What do you think about that thought?
So that's very interesting. And I would definitely agree with certain parts of that. So if you spend periods of time, training, as, low carb or fasted training, just like we talked about earlier, in the sleep low approach, you can definitely activate some of those pathways associated first with clearing out the old crappy mitochondria, mitophagy, autophagy, which is activated by both fasting and aerobic exercise, associated, the depletion of glycogen is probably part of that. And then you activate the production of new mitochondria. There's definitely, I've never seen any scenario where more healthier mitochondria was ever a bad thing, right? It's much only ever going to be a good thing. So then, he does do a high intensity sport, and then getting some carbohydrates is going to be important. So if you've spent a period of time and you can sort of, clear things up, you've maybe reduced inflammation, because if you're a ketogenic diet, there are some anti-inflammatory benefits of ketones. And then you sort of set yourself up to then use those carbohydrates better at a later point. I think that's absolutely possible. There are some potential discussion points there. So some people will say that there are certain enzymes that are down-regulated when you're on a low carbohydrate diet, which then may prevent you from being able to use carbohydrates later on. So the one that everybody measures is pyruvate dehydrogenase. That's the one that turns a pyruvate from glycolysis into acetyl-CoA to then go and be used in the Krebs cycle in the mitochondria. So there's definitely part of the discussion of whether ketogenic diets are good or bad for performance is centered on that enzyme. And it's definitely possible that if you spent a long period super low carb, not doing any high intensity exercise, because producing pyruvate dehydrogenase is driven by intensity of exercise as well. So if he was still doing some high intensity sprinting, some stuff during his low carb period, even if his performance drops slightly, he may still maintain that enzyme function. But if you're not doing that, and then you suddenly threw a load of carbohydrates into the system and tried to work really hard doing sprints, there's probably going to be an adaptation period in the other direction as well. So just depending on what he did when, I could certainly see that being beneficial. But if he'd asked his body to do the wrong thing at the wrong time, maybe there would have been a decrease in performance or an adaptation period before he could sort of perform well again. But, I think overall, he went on a low carbohydrate diet. If I remember this period of time, it was a couple of years ago, he lost a lot of excess weight, which tends to happen, when guys who have excess weight go on a low carb diet. Seems to work really well for them, in general. Like some people it doesn't, but so then he loses the excess weight. Maybe he's gained some metabolic health just from doing that, and then he can go back to sort of training and eating in a more targeted way for basketball. So I think that makes good sense.
Is there data to show you get increased mitochondrial density on a lower carb program?
No, nobody's done that. And so people have studied the pathways. So we've looked at it in mice. You've looked at like an increase in longevity, depending on the study, an increase in exercise performance, again, in mice, and some of the biochemical pathways associated with that. But nobody's done that in humans, as far as I can tell. And what would be nice to see is, I know they did muscle biopsies in the FASTER study that Volek and Finney were associated with. Sorry, my dog has obviously seen somebody walking past the door, and he's not very happy about it. So they did muscle biopsies, and those studies are going to come out. So maybe they'll see that in the ketogenic diet, or the keto athletes, they'll have higher density or better quality mitochondria. I don't know that yet. It's possible, but otherwise nobody has actually checked that out.
In your strategies in working with athletes, do you ever use nutraceutical supplements to try to support mitochondria?
Yes, definitely. So either depending on some of the test results, or can be empirically, just depending on who they are. So if somebody's on a ketogenic diet, it's very rare that they won't benefit from some carnitine, particularly. That really seems to help. Then Q10, and
D-ribose.
D-ribose, we do use. Riboflavin is super important to make FAD, which is involved in complex 2 of the mitochondria. So you can get those individually. You can get them as sort of like a packaged mitochondrial health supplement. But definitely, depending on the person, we'll often use one or a combination of those.
Okay, I want to ask you a couple of questions from a few of your articles that I read. In one of them, you said that people with more muscle live longer. Mm-hmm. Quote Mark Ripito, who said, "Strong people are harder to kill than weak people and more useful in general." And then you talk about the importance of lifting stuff, but by which I assume you mean lifting weights.
Yeah.
Can you explain the importance of lifting weights for longevity?
Yeah. So if you don't like lifting weights, you don't have to go and lift weights, but there is a load of data, looking at strength. So that can be grip strength and lower body strength. It's often leg press strength. And the people test because it's easy to test. And then looking at longevity, and people who are stronger do live longer. And there's strength is probably more important than muscle mass, but muscle mass does seem to have some benefit. If you have a big set of quads because you did a load of squats, that's a really nice glucose sink that, if you have excess glucose, it's just all going to go. That's why I feel better about the fact that I have big thighs, is like I'm probably buffered against eating some more carbohydrates. That's what I tell myself anyway. So the strength is really important, and it's not like you have to be super strong. If you're just in like the top third of the population in terms of strength, automatically you're going to get a boost in longevity compared to your peers. So what does that mean? That means that you're able to walk upstairs. It means that you're able to get up and down off the toilet. You're able to do everything that you want to do or need to do in life for much, much longer. And there are some guys like Art Devaney and Doug McGuff talk about something called physiologic headroom, which is basically the difference between what you're able to do and what you do every day. So, again, I'll use myself as an example. Walking up and downstairs, getting up and out of bed, doing all those things is a very small percentage of what I can do if I then go to the gym and lift some weights. So the difference between what I can do and what I need to do every day just to live is a big difference. So that means that when I'm asked to do something, which maybe stop myself from falling, and then prevent myself from breaking a hip, which is incredibly important for longevity. If you're in your 70s or 80s, you fall and break a hip, 50% mortality within a year, right? It's super important that you're not falling and breaking hips. So just having, when your body is asked to do something like that to protect you and you're able to do that, having that headroom is super important. So that's why I think it's important to lift stuff. Strength is one of the greatest predictors of longevity, but you don't have to go to a gym if you don't want to. You can wrestle your dogs, you can climb trees, you can do yoga, particular certain types of yoga are going to help you build leg strength. Some intensity is important. So it's the type 2 muscle fibers particularly that are going to, again, somebody pushes you or you trip, that's what's going to let you put out your foot and stop you from falling. So there are a number of ways to do that, but intensity is important. And then if you get some of that, then when your body is asked to do something, it can respond, and that's what's going to save your life.
Great. In this next comment, I'm going to give you a hard time. I wrote an article called "Practical Alternatives to Processed Protein Bars," which is really a critique on protein bars, that we should stop relying on processed foods and relearn to cook our own meals. And, and that all made a lot of sense. And I thought I was going to see all these really great snack ideas other than protein bars. And your alternative was eating a can of mackerels in sauce. And I thought, oh my God, yuck.
How can you? So we spent so long. Everybody's obsessed with omega-3s. Everybody's taking fish oil. We've stopped. Except for in certain circumstances where like pharmaceutical grades fish oil can be beneficial. Just go and eat some sardines, eat some mackerel in a tin. That's like, it's the best possible thing. It's really easily digestible. If you get the fish with some bones in, you've got some calcium and phosphate and all that other good stuff. And it's protein. If you have it in tomato sauce, there's a few carbs in there. You can add a banana. So obviously there are options if you don't want to eat mackerel in a tin.
No, Tommy, that makes it even worse. A can of mackerel and tomato sauce with a banana.
Yeah, it's perfect. Savory and sweet.
No way I'm going to be sitting here at my desk in between patients eating a can of mackerel.
Just try it before you knock it. Try it. So mackerel was something that I ate a lot when I was back over in the UK. Now I'm in the US. Sardines are very popular. The Wild Planet sardines in a can. You can have them in olive oil if you prefer.
No, I like eating them, but a lot of times you're at work, you're on the run, and I just.
So then, some beef jerky, some nuts, if you have, again, leftover food, it could be anything, leftover rice, meat, whatever. Yeah. I'm very happy with all of that. And just the mackerel was my own personal favorite. But, I got a lot of flack. So my fiance as well was like, that's disgusting. Like nobody's going to want to eat mackerel out of a tin. So I kept it in there pretty much just because, just to sort of be a bit, I guess, just to be a bit different. But
no,
whatever you prefer, I'm happy with. You just don't need to be buying Quest bars. You can eat real food.
Yeah, I know the point you're making. can you explain what MRQs are? In one of your articles, you talk about moving really quickly, and then you also talk about MRQ, WANRBS, which is moving really quickly with a nice rest in between sets.
Yeah, so this is basically my way of trying to. God, that dog! I'm sorry. He's excited this morning.
I had the same thing. I did a podcast one time, and I tried locking my dog in one of the rooms. She barked. I locked her outside. She came all the way around the house, right to where we were, and started barking.
Yeah. If you lock the door, it makes it worse because they'll just stand and like paw at the door. So that was basically moving really quickly with a nice rest in between was basically my way of trying to break down high intensity interval training. So, people get really excited about, Tabata versus all these other protocols. And there are lots of different ways that you can skin that cat. It could maybe be you work as hard as you can for a minute and then you rest for 4 minutes. You do that a couple of times. Or maybe you just work really hard for 1 minute and that's it, right? As long as you've warmed up properly and all that kind of stuff. And all of these have been shown to improve cardiovascular function, right? VO2 max, which is another nice predictor of longevity. And that's what this series of articles was about, was just trying to have you develop the amount of physical performance that you need to be long and healthy for a long period of time. And that doesn't need to be an hour in the gym every day or 2 hours on the bike every day, right? You need to lift some heavy stuff. You need to move frequently. So walk up and down stairs, just be, essentially move to live rather than just be on the couch all day, not be sitting all day.
Right.
And then sometimes you just need to do some high intensity stuff. So, go and do some sprints, and you can protocolize it. You can be like exact minutes, exact rest. And some people like that. And, if that's what they need to then to go to the gym and do it because they've got this exact program they need to do, then great. But sometimes, go for a jog and then sprint up the hill a couple of times, walk back down, great, all of that stuff. So, depending on who you are, doesn't need to be difficult. Just sometimes move really quickly and then have a nice rest afterwards.
Hey, that's great. I think that's good. That's a good way to wrap this podcast is, lift something heavy, do some high intensity exercise, do some longer, lower intensity exercise, and just keep moving.
Yeah, absolutely. Then have some nice mackerel to recover afterwards.
Just don't spill it on your clothes.
Oh yeah, that stuff stains. It doesn't smell good.
So for listeners who'd like to get a hold of you, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Yeah, the best place is Nourish Balance Thrive. So nourishbalancethrive.com. I mentioned the predictive tool that we have. So you do a questionnaire and it predicts whether you have some of these sort of common patterns we see in athletes. People can go to nbt.ai and they can just try that tool for themselves. You can do the questionnaire. It's part of our intake for our patients. You can see what we're asking people, and then it will give you some predictions on the other end. I also have an email series where I cover a lot of the science and some of the tips and tricks that we use with people. So you basically get, every week you get part of our playbook. And so you just go to nourishbalancethrive.com/highlights. You can sign up for that. But yeah, any of those things, you'll find many ways to contact me and the rest of the team.
Great. Those are some great resources. Thank you for an interesting podcast, Tommy. And I'll talk to you soon.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Okay.